Welcome to panel 3. Couple of reminders before we start. We have 3 speakers. We have an hour, so I just have to remind each of the 3 speakers to be mindful of the 15-minute guideline. And then to everyone, please put questions in the Q&A section. And if you would, if appropriate, direct your questions to a particular speaker, and then when we get to the Q&A, I will ask the questions. So to start, we have Cassidy Ernst speaking on a critical inclusive approach to instructing on genocide education in the U.S. So Cassidy, it's all you.
So today I want to invite you all to look at genocide education through a new lens, one designed by integrating Edward Said's post-colonial theory with the Freirean concept of critical consciousness. Post-colonial theory, as applied in the context of this proposal, recognizes the ongoing influence of settler colonialism in education and the practice of othering, particularly in the writing of history and history curricula. While post-colonial theory will provide the tools necessary to expose colonial constructs in education and current curricula, the concept of critical consciousness will provide us with the tools to respond to and shift from an ahistorical form of genocide education toward a version that centers collective liberation, prevention methods, and advocacy. In order to fill the gap between research and education, and that between education and prevention, I propose that we must instill in ourselves, in our educators, and in our students what I am calling a genocide consciousness, something that I believe can only be done through delivering a professional development that is designed to empower and better equip teachers who are educating their students on the topic of genocide. So I'm obviously not going to be able to go through all of the professional development, but I'm going to go pretty quickly through slides to walk you guys through what that professional development could look like. So here's an overview of, there would be about 5 sessions, each one a week long, kind of like a genocide education boot camp. And so I think as researchers and educators, especially at the university level of genocide, we've become really familiar with these topics and very well versed in discussing them with each other or explaining them sometimes to other people that may not be as familiar, but we forget how much of our knowledge and our research may not be accessible to people to educators at the secondary level who are tasked with covering history from a very long, wide scope. And so I asked myself, how can we make it more accessible to educators teaching the next generation? So it'd be asking questions like this, getting educators comfortable and asking what their experience has been, what they do know about genocide, if they feel prepared to teach it. And each session would come along with some of these recommended readings that would dive deep, and they would read them before, and then they would be topic of discussion during that session. And each session has these outcomes. And so let me see here. So starting from the basis, it's kind of like, what is genocide education? Why is it important? Where did genocide education come from in the United States? What are the key principles? What mandates and requirements inform genocide education in the United States? Considering there's only 22 states that actually require it and mandate it to be represented in curriculum, that leaves a lot of room for miseducation, or we don't really know what's being taught or how it's being taught or the effectiveness. There's no way to gauge that due to the decentralized nature of the United States education system. But we are noticing that there is a problem in how it's being taught, or more so how it's not being taught, or maybe a combination of both. These are some statistics that I'm sure you're all familiar with of kind of the lack thereof new generations' understanding of genocide, and specifically the preparation and planning and these pre-genocidal stages and things that lead up to it. And I use the California History and Social Science framework as a reference point for what secondary educators likely know, though I know it is not limited to. and what they're asked to teach. And it was very easy to see, like, these gaps in genocide education were made very visible by just looking at keywords and the frequency in which they were mentioned. The HSS framework for California, for example, is over 800 pages long, and it's suggested history content to teach students from 7th to 12th grade. And it only mentions the word genocide 20 times. And that's including the endnotes and the bibliography at the end. And these keywords and their frequencies, they start to decrease once you have the Holocaust that is mentioned 18 times, which is still not enough. And that's only within 2 grades being educated on. And so the next session would dive deeper into the key tenets of what critical genocide studies is. Before we can ask educators to teach with this lens, we need to give them the tools to familiarize them with what it is and why it's important. And so when I talk about critical genocide studies, it's, in other words, a call for critical thinking about the field of genocide studies that decenters our biases and exploring our presuppositions and throwing light on blind spots in the hope of further enriching this dynamic field. That was a quote by, I think, I can't remember his name right now, sorry. Hinton, maybe, Alexander Hinton. And I think it's also asking them to incorporate curricula that is more comparative, and not to create a hierarchy of suffering, but so that we have a better understanding of what stages of genocide look like outside of maybe Gregory Stanton's model, which I'll talk about in the next session, that we have used to make sense of the Holocaust. And it's predominantly used by the US Holocaust Memorial Museum and a lot of other genocide education resources. But becoming over-reliant on just the one case study of the Holocaust or just one means and mode of educating on it or how we understand it, it puts us at risk for not being able to identify other patterns of genocide. And so these are just some of the questions that we would ask educators after doing their readings. And I think this could look like bringing in questions to teachers and for teachers to take to their students questions like, how has the definition of genocide changed over time? Who were the stakeholders negotiating the internationally accepted definition, and what constitutes the crime of genocide? What did they have to lose? What did they have to gain? And with these questions and bringing those into dialogue, then it could spark a lot of more deep diving into these motives behind the negotiation of genocide and kind of why it is the way that it is now. And I think that these questions are important to ask so that we can have the power as people and students and educators to question systemic oppression and other structural violence and structural oppression that is kind of maintaining genocidal ideology or repressing the history of genocide. And so session 3, this dives into more of what those models and approaches could be made available for educators to incorporate in their classrooms. As I was saying earlier, the comparative model, also, as you notice in the title, critical inclusive approach, the inclusive model, which is Andrew Basso's inclusive comparative approach, which is incorporating commonly excluded experiences of genocide into curricula and what they have to offer and give a more compound, comprehensive understanding of genocide as a process, opposed to perpetuating this understanding that genocide is an event. And so session 3 will go into these cases, different cases. I predominantly use Deborah Meyerson's temporal model and Andrew Basso's comparative inclusive approach to create an example of what a curriculum could look like and what the benefits would be for students and teachers and ultimately society as a whole. I'm queer, so I did a deep dive into the queer experiences of the Holocaust, since this is one of the experiences or one of the cases of genocide that we do know is predominantly being taught, though there's always room for more education on the Holocaust. But without offering access to diverse experiences of genocide in the classroom, educational spaces will continue to perpetuate a one-dimensional understanding of genocide by not supplying their students with another reference point for the process outside of the Holocaust. This limits the conversation on prevention methods because it creates a population with not only limited knowledge to use in order to compare their societal experiences, but also by augmenting the argument that the Holocaust is unique and ultimately discouraging students to speak up when they do witness similarities out of fear that it may be disrespectful or that it could potentially come off as downplaying the Holocaust severity. Though this argument is outside the scope of this presentation, it has been brought into discussion in order to demonstrate how our current models of genocide education have established a particularly dangerous catch-22, where students are provided with one example of genocide in the classroom, and then they are told that it is wrong to compare anything to it. So how can we disrupt this? How can we give educators and students the tools they need in order to be disruptors of genocidal ideology and genocide in general? So session 4 would be the example that I was alluding to earlier. I don't think I'll have time to really dive into it and the benefits, but I would like to demonstrate this catch-22 and how it has perpetuated the current political climate of the United States by inserting the queer temporality of the Holocaust and how elaborating on, and I would like to elaborate on the inclusion of commonly excluded experience of genocide and how they have the potential to close some of the gaps that I've been alluding to today in genocide education, specifically the gap between education and prevention. The importance of this critical shift will be reinforced by emphasizing how the lack of critical inclusive genocide curricula has contributed to, maintained, and normalized the dehumanization and the structural oppression of LGBTQ+ individuals. This is a quote by Andrew Basso, and it really represents why I think it's important to have this inclusive approach. These exclusive institutions may lead to individualized and isolated histories and possibly to discrimination and structural violence against omitted victims. And there's a lot that studying these different experiences, like queer temporality of the Holocaust, can add to our understanding of the timing of the Holocaust. And this is a timeline. If you can see, we can go back all the way to 1920 and look at these different pre-genocidal stages of the Holocaust. Whereas if you look at other curricular models, it often starts in 1933 when Hitler was elected. And that leaves out important details like 1923, where there was a beer hall push where Hitler and Ernst tried to overthrow the Bavarian government. And that right there alone is another pre-genocidal precondition to genocide, something that parallels a lot of governments before mass violence occurs. And it continues, I don't have time to go through them. And looking at the Night of Long Knives in 1934, which was about 600 SS leaders that were massacred by the Nazi Party for being assumed that they were queer. And I'm going to skip through this, but this is the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum's timeline of what they provide with teachers to educate on. And the outcomes, you can see they're highlighted in pink. It calls out to include the Roma, the people with disabilities, Poles, Soviet prisoners of war, Afro-Germans, identify persecution of Jews, and others gradually increased over time. Even in these educational outcomes, homosexuals are not mentioned. And before I move on to 5, the repercussions of these exclusions and lack of memorializations later on of queer experiences of the Holocaust have kept our community as an outgroup and consistently at risk for experiencing genocide. And then session 5 would kind of round out and ask educators to discuss what they learned and what they would like to use this knowledge to, and how they would like to apply it in their classrooms. As I conducted my research, I realized that oftentimes curricula and other educational resources used to instruct on genocide leave out the majority of suffering that survivors and victims of genocide endure, essentially omitting important facts and experiences crucial to the understanding of the preparation, planning, and execution of the crime of genocide, likely because the inclusion of them would be amplifying the months in which countries like ours did nothing to intervene. We instruct on dates and events leading up to mass violence, and then we fast forward through genocidal stages to dates like Liberation Day, arguably when survivors and victims become human to the world again. We must stop asking teachers to instruct on the parts of history where the world, or more so the governments of the world, started to finally pay attention and replace it with what happened while the world looked away. Educating with this pattern has taught us the temporality from the oppressor's point of view, and is conceivably why we as a nation are so comfortable with the earliest stages and warning signs of genocide, including the most instrumental tool used to commit genocide, that being dehumanization. We have learned when to look away and when to look back, but we have never been taught to keep watching, to be outraged, to cry, to challenge. I think that's my time.
Thank you, Cassidy. We now go to George Dalbo on unsettling narratives.
First, I'd just like to thank Kate and Kim and Jim and Lorna for organizing all of this. It's so great to be in a space thinking about not only genocide, but genocide education specifically. And I'm so thrilled to follow Cassidy and thinking about critical genocide education. And so I'm going to be talking about Indigenous genocide education a little bit today. And I want to start with this question, which is something that has driven most of my work for the last, decade or so. And it is, what does teaching and learning about genocide look like in a settler colonial nation state, or in settler colonial nation states like the United States and Canada? And I think the issue here is that we have genocide education, which is becoming, as Cassidy alluded to, right, much more robust in the last decade, or since even the 1990s with the Holocaust education. Genocide education has really become a part of the US curriculum. And I think Indigenous education as well in many places around the United States. We're kind of in a golden age of Indigenous studies and Indigenous education in some places. But I think for me, these two areas of study and education rarely intersect. And I think that's been an issue that I've confronted in my work quite a bit over the last decade or so, as I mentioned. And so what I'd like to talk about today is the idea of an American high school genocide studies course. And the idea that we often do in many places around the United States, though they're not as common as they should be, perhaps, right? Genocide studies courses in American high schools that don't center or indeed teach about Indigenous genocide. And I think that's an interesting puzzle, to be in a settler colonial nation state, in a state with a history and a memory of violence in some ways, a collective memory. And this isn't something that is central or even taught about at the margins of many genocide studies courses. And so I'd like to just share one quote. I've worked with teachers, I've interviewed teachers all over the United States who teach about genocide, often in semester-long elective courses, sometimes not elective courses. And though this is just one quote from one teacher in Minneapolis, Minnesota, I think it represents much of what I've seen in talking to dozens of teachers across the United States. And so I'll read the quote here. The teacher in question says, "I don't talk about Native Americans, again, in this semester-long genocide studies course. I don't talk about Native Americans in the class because it would need more time than I have to do it justice. And I don't want to teach about Native Americans, like, let's talk about Indians now. And so to be able to talk about individual tribes and their experiences and the fact that it lasted for 500 years, I don't have time. So I tell the kids that, yes, this is genocide. Yes, this is super important, but I don't have the capacity to address this. It is a tough thing, and I struggle with it every time I teach the class. Yes, this is something that 100% needs to be taught, but that would kind of have to take the place of the Holocaust as the focus of the class so that I would need 6 or 7 weeks at least to do it justice, and I don't want it to be a passing thing." And so I'd like to think about, for the rest of the time I have, this quote and maybe unpack it a little bit, as much as we're able in the remaining time. And so my work often starts from two assumptions. The first is that the United States is a settler colonial nation state. And I don't think I need to expound upon that for folks in this room. When I talk about settler colonialism in contexts like this, or even with students, high school students or college-aged students, I often use this painting, which I'm sure is familiar to most in the room, American Progress by John Gast. And not to go through this too deeply, but the painting has what my students often assume to be Lady Liberty, but is rather Columbia, with the star of empire on her forehead, floating above the American landscape, moving from east to west, ushering with her waves of settlement. And you can see the wagons and the stagecoach and ultimately the trains pushing ever westward, bringing the telegraph, the wire kind of coiled in her arm, and pushing Native Americans, Native peoples, and the buffalo, and indeed darkness off to the side of the painting. And I often ask my students, what is the book that Columbia is cradling in her arm? And the response I often get from students young and old is the Bible. And I think that makes sense given what we know about colonialism, what we know about imperialism. And I think it's amazing to zoom in on this painting and see that it's actually not the Bible, but zooming in reveals this to be a school book. And so I think this brings me to my second assumption, that public schooling in the United States, if the United States, the first is that the United States is a settler colonial nation state, the second being that public schooling in the United States is a tool of settler colonialism. And I think it's helpful in some ways to think about genocide education in the United States also as a tool or something that can be co-opted in service of the settler colonial nation state. I think many folks, myself included as a teacher, we like to think of genocide education as something critical, something that's pushing the bounds of traditional education. But I think in many ways it falls firmly and squarely within traditional education in the United States and furthers settler colonialism. When I think about settler colonialism in this context, I think about the work of Dolores Calderon. Calderon has referred to settler grammars, or in this case, curricula that is used to create for students a grammar, a framework to understand the country in which they live, the nation state in which they live. And I think if we think about curricula in this way, it helps us to understand how education furthers the goals of settler colonialism and establishes what Wolf might call the logics of settler colonialism. And we can look at this in practice. So this was a study that was done by Sarah Shear and her colleagues several years ago, looking at indigenous erasure. And they looked at all 50 states and they pulled out social studies standards. And so these are the things that ultimately direct teachers in what to teach. Often they're very content driven, the US Civil War, the Revolutionary War, the list of events and names. And these are what's shown here on this graph. This research shows us all of the standards in the 50 states that cover indigenous issues. And you'll notice that the bars are broken in two. The bottom portion of each bar, which is darker black, is content that is pre-1900. So mentions of indigenous people pre-1900. The upper portions of most of the bars, not all, but most that are lighter gray, these are standards that mention content or issues that are post-1900. And so we see that most students in the United States, if teachers are teaching to these standards, and that's a big if, but if teachers are teaching to these standards, are really receiving content about indigenous peoples in the past, not in the present or the contemporary, not more recent history. And I think this is an erasure of indigenous people in the United States. We can see this, how indigenous people are erased from the curricula. if we think about, and I'm so glad that Cassidy mentioned mandates, right? That many states across the United States since really 2015, there were certainly states before 2015, but there's been quite a few states post 2015 that have passed specific pieces of legislation mandating Holocaust education. And often these post 2015 mandates mention, and this is the language that most states use, other so-called other genocides. So they're mandating that students learn about at some point within their middle, sometimes even elementary, middle, and secondary experiences, they learn about the Holocaust and other genocides. As far as I'm aware, there's one state that specifically lists in this legislation indigenous genocide broadly, and then also local examples. So this is Minnesota. The legislation mentions Dakota and Anishinaabe or Ojibwe genocide and provides examples of these for teachers. Minnesota is the only state currently that lists indigenous genocide. And I, living in Minnesota for many years, was the author of that legislation. And I think is the reason, given my interest in my work, that it includes indigenous genocide. And so we have all of these states that are mandating Holocaust and genocide education, but leaving out indigenous genocide from this legislation. If we look at this in a similar but slightly different way, we could look at Alex Hinton's canon, so-called canon of genocide studies. And Hinton is really looking at which cases of genocide receive attention in scholarship and has organized these into a hierarchy. And I think most of us understand that there is a hierarchy within genocide studies and a hierarchy then within genocide education. And I think there's always, unfortunately, there's always a lag from, genocide studies or any academic study into education. But certainly, I think this canon of genocide studies would represent what is being taught. And I'm sure Mark will tell us whether that's true or not, right? What is being taught in schools across the United States, where the Holocaust receives the most attention. Armenia and Rwanda are certainly second. And then we start to get into other cases of genocide that receive some attention, but not that much, right? And this is certainly what I found in working with teachers across the United States, and understanding what's happening in their classes as they teach these genocide studies elective courses. And we see on here indigenous genocide. Hinton puts it within this 20th century core, so maybe the second tier down, but towards the bottom. And this is indigenous genocide, indigenous peoples taken as a whole. And it's really into the periphery that we start to see specific cases of indigenous peoples represented, or in specific cases of indigenous genocide represented in scholarship and then indeed in education, in curricula. I think this teacher, to pull out just one chunk of this quote that I read at the beginning, this teacher says, but that would kind of have to take the place of the Holocaust as the focus of the class, and the that here being indigenous genocide. And I think when I first was talking to this teacher and digging through all of this data and looking at a quote like this, I was understanding that the Holocaust is not leaving, because we focus so much on the Holocaust in the United States, it's not leaving much space to study other cases of genocide. And more recently, I think I've come to the work of Michael Rothberg around multi-directional memory. And Rothberg reminds us that the result of memory conflict is not less memory, but more. And I think this in many ways has pushed me to think that it's maybe not that the Holocaust and our focus on the Holocaust in many of these courses, where the Holocaust would receive 6 or 7 weeks and other cases of genocide might receive passing mention or perhaps at most a week of instructional time, that the Holocaust isn't crowding out other cases of genocide, that our study of the Holocaust isn't pushing out these other cases and not allowing space and time to discuss them, but it's actually the opposite. And I think Rothberg would argue that it is indeed our focus on the Holocaust that has, in more recent years, allowed for these mandates that talk about other genocides. even if they're not specifically called out. And it ultimately, I think, will be where we then start to see Indigenous genocide come into genocide education. And that's really, I think, what I'm hopeful for. And my call is that in the next decade, in the next few years, other genocides will include Indigenous genocide.
Well, thank you, George. Okay, now we'll go to Mark on Holocaust and genocide education in America. Mark, you're up.
Thank you to James for sharing this. Thank you very much, Kim, for all of your work in coordinating, and Kate. These are old friends of mine, and I won't bore you with how, but I'm so honored to be here. Thank you, George and Cassidy, for setting the stage and really offering such interesting perspectives and I think important information for all of us to consider. So I'm going to look today, talk a little bit about Holocaust and genocide education in America. It's fairly limited in scope to the States, my research that is, but you know, it's also limited by the time frame, as everything is, right? And so hopefully someday my 4,000-page book on this will come out and everybody will read it cover to cover. But until then, at the end, I'll provide a slide, and I hope you'll reach out, and I'm happy to share data. I regularly parse out my data by state and things like that and share that with other groups. So you're welcome to contact me. But I want to look kind of big picture today and provide what I hope are just some useful talking points and things that we can maybe consider as we think about the way we approach the Holocaust and the way we approach genocide education in this country. So, you know, I wanted to start off because I think that, you know, there's so much being done well that occasionally I get really irked. And there have been some just really bafflingly stupid things written recently. And I think that as scholars, teachers in particular, we've got to be kind of aware of that. So I'm referencing here an article that came out in The Economist that said, you know, 1 in 5 Americans thinks the Holocaust is a myth. No, they don't. They do not. And, you know, I provided the link down here. I just said of possible interest, but that BBC podcast is really worth listening to. There is a movement within Holocaust education, right? Is Holocaust education making anti-Semitism worse? People love dead Jews, and on and on and on. And we really need to reject the sensationalism. If you're trying to sell books and newspapers and magazines, then you say inflammatory things, but that's not what scholarship is. And I think we need to be really clear about that. And I think that if we're trying to influence teachers and trying to provide useful information to students and politicians and so on and so forth, we've got to get rid of the hyperbole and the nonsensical rhetoric and deal in fact. And there's no shortage of that. The Holocaust is the best documented event in the history of the world. And so as we look at this, I wanted to provide just a quick example. Again, no, 1 in 5 Americans does not think the Holocaust is a myth. The Pew Research Center redid that study, but asked a very different question. See, the problem with the survey that The Economist did, and they knew this when they did it, is they used opt-in surveys. And that's just not a very honest way to conduct research. And so the Pew redid it, but they did it, they had some fun. And they said, okay, how many of you are licensed to operate a class SSGN nuclear submarine? Now, for context, there are 4 class SSGN nuclear submarines in the American military total. So imagine their astonishment when they discovered that 12% of young people are licensed to drive those things. I mean, that's absolutely incredible. Or it's inaccurate. And that would be the case here, right? So using the same methodology that The Economist used, the Pew came up with that data. And all that is to say, let's stop lighting fires. Let's stop, putting lipstick on pigs and glitter on everything and trying to get attention. And I'm not accusing anybody here of doing that, but that needs to be our approach needs to be scholarly and thoughtful, and most of all, genuine and honest. And to date, it hasn't been from everybody, probably from some people, probably from most people. So enter my survey data that I want to share with you. And I really had to go, okay, what is critical? Because there's just not much time. I thought this was interesting. And so I used a survey this summer, last year, 2023, which was not opt-in. It was a purposive sample of 539 American educators. And I asked them a series of questions about how they teach about genocide. One of the things that I thought that the folks that attended this panel might find particularly interesting was the factors that teachers report influencing their choice to teach about genocide in their pedagogy. So we'll start there. And I think it's equally revealing what is important to teachers and what is not. And so what is important to teachers is listed on the left, and I don't think that'll surprise you terribly. We could have a long conversation about time constraints, and I think that George began that conversation, and that's, it's a really important one for us to have, and there are things we can do. And then I also think it's really important to point out what's not important to teachers, and I hope you'll forgive me, but as I'm looking at this, I'm familiar enough with my own data set. I reversed the percentages here. So it's actually state mandates are 20% and political pressures are 4%. And I can parse political pressure down into local, state, and national too. So if you want to know what percentage of teachers in Florida feel pressured by the state and how and are influenced by that, I can give you that figure. These are national, but yeah, I want to point out that the political pressure is actually the lowest. State mandates are about 20%. And since mandates have come up in the other two conversations, I just want to add this because I think it's really important. Nebraska just passed a mandate a couple of years ago, and we did it exactly the wrong way in that it's not funded. The only meaningful genocide education mandates are funded. If it is funded, something might happen. If it is not, it is noise. And, it assuages guilt and makes politicians look good for a minute, but it produces nothing. And there's a tremendous amount of data on that, not least that teachers are unaffected by it. If it is, if there's money behind it, as there is in several states, then we can look at that and go, okay, well, what's that money being used to do? And you can trace that to all kinds of different programmatic results and learning objectives and things like that. So all that to say, if you're advocating for a mandate in a majority of states that don't already have one, be sure you're advocating for funding. And if you're in a state like mine, Nebraska, which has a mandate, push for funding, which we are. And I'm actually relatively optimistic we might get it. I don't like the way this slide turned out, so I threw another one together, but this does give you a pretty good visual, and I do think it's kind of striking, right? So there's been talk about what is taught, and people have rightly pointed out on this panel today that the Holocaust, by and large, I'll give you the percentages here in a minute, but by and large is the most taught act of genocide. And some of that is, well, there are an awful lot of reasons for that. We won't get into it. Notice that genocide in Rwanda and the genocide of American Indians, which I think George again pointed out earlier, and I appreciate this, that's a huge group, right? Now, it's not all that different from saying the genocide of the Jews when you realize that the Jews are some of them Ashkenazi, some not, some Polish, some Czech, some Latvian, some Lithuanian, some Russian, etc. Right? These are different cultures. I think that's a really important thing, right? When we group all of the people who occupied this continent, pre-white people, into one group, it's problematic for sure. It is being taught about, and I think that that's worth noting. And in fact, a lot of teachers reported on that. And if you're interested in the data, I'm happy to share it. But if we jump ahead, I can share percentages. Now, again, this wasn't an opt-in survey. So purposive sampling gave me people who say they teach about genocide to respond to this survey. So don't interpret this as 96% of teachers teach about the Holocaust, right? And so you're all of a sudden thinking that's going to pop up in your 9th grade algebra class. It probably isn't. But you know, of people who teach about human rights and genocide studies in general, these are the topics that are coming up and the rate at which they are, more or less. And I parsed out also data on each of these 12 acts of genocide that I studied on film. And of course, we can't dig too deeply into that today. I have, looks like 4.5 minutes left, but we can get started a little bit. There are a few observations. So one thing, there's an increasing use of documentary film. Now, not everywhere. So for example, the most taught film to teach about Rwanda is still Hotel Rwanda. But it is followed closely by Ghosts of Rwanda and I'm Not Leaving. And those are both documentaries. In the case of the Holocaust, the most popular film in 2015 and again in 2019 was Schindler's List by a landslide. Today, the most popular film is Path to Nazi Genocide from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. It's also worth noting that Ken Burns' new documentary, when I conducted this study, had been out for a little over a year and had already found its way into the top 10 and in many instances the top 5. Now, some of that has to do with Ken Burns, but you know, there is a reliance upon documentary film that's worth noting. There's also a decline in the use of some of the films that many of us have been saying for a while. Geez, do you have to? Boy in the Striped Pajamas is still used, but perhaps less so than it was. You know, and I can look at that. I can provide you with that over 2015, 2019, but in 2023, it was less popular than it had ever been. And then there's a need to greater access and awareness of film for especially acts of genocide other than the Holocaust. I think that many of the films available on the Holocaust are pretty well known. But for example, one of the most popular films for teaching about, well, the two most popular for teaching about genocide in the former Yugoslavia are Behind Enemy Lines, which doesn't have much to do with genocide in Yugoslavia, and Once Brothers, the 30 for 30 documentary on ESPN. And you could say the same thing about that, although it is an absolutely brilliant documentary film. It's really worth watching for what that's worth. You know, also looking at literature, I just want to point out, you know, we're using survivor testimony a lot, and there are implications there. What does that mean for pedagogy? Time constraints, again, need to be discussed. And in particular, you look at, for example, the Armenian genocide. Half of the teachers in America have one lesson or less to teach about the Armenian genocide. So what are they using? How are they fitting it in? And what can we do to support them are all important questions. And then I'd point out we're all deeply indebted to Samantha Power, and I think we all already know that, but her work, A Problem from Hell, is the second most popular book for teaching about Armenia, the first most popular for teaching about genocide in Bosnia, I think second for Rwanda and third for Cambodia, maybe. So it's really widely utilized. So, you know, to kind of wrap there, what do we do with this? Where to from here? And I want to remind people that I don't think there's any value in sensationalism. There is. If you're trying to sell books and your objective is to make money, yes, keep naming things the most outlandish thing you can possibly think of with no regard for whether or not it's true or accurate. But otherwise, you know, maybe we could shy away from the hyperbole a little bit and focus on scholarship. You know, the question of what is within our control is, I think, very important. And James is going to tell me I have a minute. Thanks, James. You know,
Mark, you have 1.5 minutes.
Oh, do I? Wonderful. Oh, you're a blessing. Thank you. You know, so I think that you're not going to prevent the Turkish lobby from attempting to prevent acknowledgement of the Armenian genocide 100+ years later. You're not going to prevent them from doing it. That doesn't mean it's not going to pass. So what is within our control and what is not? I think most importantly, support classroom teachers in every possible way, whether you are one or you're an administrator or whatever you are. The teachers are the ones doing the work. I am painfully aware that when I write an academic peer-reviewed article, I am screaming into the void until it winds up in the hands of a classroom teacher who decides to utilize it. And that's where the power is. So I'm grateful to the EIHR and IAGS for their work in that. And I believe, don't hesitate to reach out.
Okay, thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
Go to the Q&A, and the first question, Cassidy, fasten your seatbelt. This is a long one. Let me bring it up on my screen and read it. This is from Chris. Fascinating viewpoint on genocidal awareness, Cassidy. I wonder, would you ever perhaps bring in works by scholars such as Irving Lewis Horowitz or Israel Charney that have critically examined the psychological perspectives of societies and governments during earlier waves of post-neocolonial research to start conversations about cross-generational concerns?
Luckily I had time to like read it and kind of think about it because it is a really good question. I didn't necessarily use those authors or academics, but I did use a lot of Hannah Arendt to inform my practice and my research and for the development of the professional development, like specifically her understanding of dehumanization and the stages from the destroying the moral person, the juridical person, and basically creating outgroups into creating them into animals versus humans so that we can justify mass violence. Well, not we, but oppressors and orchestrators of genocide. And I think it's really important, and it makes space if we could use dehumanization as just one, that could be another session of professional development, is discussing and interrogating what does dehumanization mean. If we do not include other instances of genocide and processes of genocide and these excluded groups from memorializations like homosexual experiences of the Holocaust, then are we contributing to the dehumanization of those groups? Are we contributing to the dehumanization of the people that were targeted in instances of genocide that we're not including often in curricula? And I think that can be seen really easily when you look at, like if we were to have just included one simple fact that like homosexuals after the Holocaust were not given reparations. They were not recognized in the Nuremberg trials as having experienced violence. These laws were still enshrined in the German Constitution until 1995. Homosexuals that were released from liberation camps were actually forced to be re-imprisoned. And had we had that knowledge, maybe today would look different. Maybe the way our group is treated would be different. And so I think including this, like the scientific sociology and the psychological perspective of dehumanization is critical in order to push thinking forward and kind of instill that genocide consciousness that I was alluding to. So I hope that answered it, your question.
Okay, thank you. Another question actually turned up in the chat, so let me bring that up. This is from Lorna, I believe. 3 great presentations. Thank you so much. It would be great to get your input into our educational project, especially regarding available and reputable sources. I.e. not the boy in the striped pajamas, a useful starting point would be Mark's research into what schools are doing. Mark or George, do you want to take that?
George, if you want to start, I'll jump in after maybe.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, thanks, Lauren. I appreciate the question. I think for me, when it comes to thinking about Indigenous genocide, and I'll keep my comments focused on that, would be to teach the local. So much of my work has looked at teachers that are either not teaching about Indigenous genocide, are teaching about it in some very passing way, or are teaching about something that is, maybe connected to the nation state in the United States. So, for instance, many teachers across the United States use the Trail of Tears and the relocation of Native groups to the Midwest, right, as an example of genocide, rightly so, as an example of genocide. But I think I've seen this from many teachers who are teaching in places where that history is not local for them or their students. And so I can use myself as an example. I teach in Wisconsin, and there was a war, the Black Hawk War, which took place in the 1830s, and ultimately removed the Ho-Chunk and other indigenous peoples from the land to allow for white settlement. And many of the students I teach, their families have been on this land 5, 6, 7 generations, and they have this connection to this local history. But when we talk about the Black Hawk War in my senior genocide studies elective course, they're just unfamiliar with it. And so I think that's where, certainly they've encountered the notion of Indigenous genocide, but somewhat disconnected from the land on which they're living. And I think that's where we could tie this back to settler colonialism and say that's exactly what settler colonialism would want, right? This is settler colonialism shifting strategically to maintain white presence and dominance over the land, to learn about Indigenous genocide as it comes into consciousness in the United States, but not in the local context.
Yeah, George, that's a really good, I'm glad I let you go first. I think that localizing history is really valuable, and for countless reasons. I'm going to put in the chat to everyone here a resource that won't localize the history for everybody, but it does for us here in Nebraska. This is an incredible project being done by Dr. Beth Selden-Daton, and it is. I just want you to check it out and then think about how you can bring it to your state. I'm actually working with a group in Florida to do something similar, and I'm working with Beth on this one. But localizing it is really important for 2 reasons. Number one, and you've noticed in my 15 minutes, I'm sure that I speak candidly in platitudes a lot of the time. Textbooks are garbage. I have yet to see a good one, really. But I've seen so many examples of bad ones. I'll never forget students coming to me with Prentice Hall's America, Pathways to the Present. And they said, Mr. G, either you're wrong or the book's wrong. And I was like, oh no, what did I get wrong? And they showed me the passage on Rwanda that said that the French ended the genocide in Rwanda. And I mean, if you read the entire 64-word paragraph, like there might be a couple of fairly simple words that aren't inaccurate, but the whole thing is just junk. But then it suggests that the French ended the genocide in Rwanda, which is just the opposite of true, right? And so it's really a stunning thing. And that's just an example, but that's also an example of a textbook driven by machines in Texas, machines in California, machines in Florida, with their own very specific agendas, but all the buying power. And in a state like Nebraska with 1.9 million people, people aren't writing textbooks for us, but they are bowing to the will of their overlords in Texas when they write them, because it's a money-making operation. And so I think that for the teacher, and what we all can participate in, right, is helping the teacher with the resources and the things that they might utilize and go, okay, well, what did happen here? I taught in the city where Malcolm X was born, a very overshadowed figure of history. And I teach in the city, or I taught, I still do, in the city where the trial of Chief Standing Bear took place. That may not find its way into a textbook written for an audience in Texas, but it's incredibly important history. And it's very, very local. We can go to the place that this happened. We can speak with the ancestors of people that this, still affects to this day. It affects all of us. So, I think just really to piggyback off George's point there, the localized history can be so powerful. So thank you.
George, I'm waiting for other questions to come in. You didn't mention, and I wish I were wrong here, but the painting you shared with us on American Progress still hangs in the Capitol building.
And to Mark's point, I mean, to yours and to Mark's, it's still present in most textbooks and not unpacked critically, within the text of the textbook. I'm hoping teachers are doing that work in classrooms, but yeah, unfortunately so.
Yeah. And I was encouraged, George, by your data. I did content analysis maybe 5 years ago of the social studies standards in all 50 states and the District of Columbia. And very little or nothing on the genocide of indigenous peoples.
Yeah, and I think you always need to look at those standards. I think any formal curricula, as Mark mentioned with textbooks, right? How many teachers now in 2024? Probably too many, right? But how many are, teaching, from or to the textbook? How many are, taking these standards and teaching them as written? I think sometimes we make too much of, mandates, the language and mandates and the language and standards and textbooks. But I do think they have some power. And certainly I can speak for the case, of Minnesota, where the standards dictate what the local historical, so the state historical society puts into their textbook. So a case of a local textbook where in Minnesota Studies is a course for sixth graders in social studies, and the textbook follows the standards because it's written by the Historical Society, which tailors the book to these standards, and so they're writing out quite a bit of Indigenous history or warping the way that Indigenous peoples are represented within the text to meet the text of the standards, and so. Yeah, and again, I don't offer too many solutions other than to throw my hands up and say settler colonialism in the hopes that, we'll start to take a look at settler colonialism as a guiding logic of, genocide education in the United States.
Can I jump in there actually, James? Is there time?
Sure.
So it was Cassidy, it was your talk that got me thinking about this initially, and George, you've kind of brought me back to it. But as we think about what's being taught, I was really honored last summer to speak at the same conference that a former student of mine, now an academic, was speaking at in Sarajevo, and that was a lot of fun. But what she spoke about was really powerful. She studies the Holocaust, but she studies gender studies within the Holocaust, and she was crediting Wendy Lauer and several others with sort of opening the doors to that and pointing out that there was a period of time in the study of the history of the Holocaust in which gender studies was patently ignored, simply because, the idea was, well, the experience was the same for everybody. And of course, that's not true, but it took scholarship from people like Wendy to get us there. And as I thought about that, and as I think about some of the things that have come up today and what's missing in education and what we'd like to see added and localizing and things of that nature, and especially that of Native peoples to this continent, we've got examples of progress. And I think that that's really meaningful. I realize that there are forces at work to try to make this difficult too, and they're pretty good at what they do. And I realize that teachers are under a tremendous amount of pressure, but that's where I'd circle back to my point that what we can do is support them. And if we make the resources available and the time available for them to do it, we can see progress both in scholarship and what's being taught. And I think that that's I think it's critical to what we're doing.
Although I will say, Mark, I sometimes refer to myself, although I've been teaching at the university level for, gosh, most of my life at this point, I'm a recovering middle school teacher. And what I like to refer to as the curriculum police were ever present in the middle school I taught in to make sure that we were teaching the district and really the state standards with very little. And of course, once the door was shut, we taught whatever we want.
Exactly. That James, that's exactly what came to my mind. We were all pretty good at nodding our heads and smiling and writing down what was expected and then doing what needed to be done with the door closed.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. So thank you to the three of you for an excellent session.